When growth stalls, most leaders reach for surface fixes like new campaigns, a sharper sales deck, even new hires. But the real issues are often deeper, such as misaligned systems, broken handoffs, or unreliable data. That's why we built the Growth Readiness Score. In just 5 minutes, you'll get a clear score across 4 critical areas of your revenue operations and see how you stack up against your peers with benchmark data. Tap the link in the show notes to get started. It's quick, insightful, and often reveals issues leaders don't expect.
I look at quota like this. Satisfactory performance should hit the number. Exceptional performance should be able to exceed it, and unsatisfactory performance should not hit it, right? But if the team is consistently not hitting quota, you failed your team by setting an incorrect metric to begin with.
You're listening to RevOps Champions, a podcast created for B2B leaders to help you align your people, streamline your processes, trust your data, and leverage technology in order to grow your business. Hello and welcome back. Today I'm joined by Bryan Byler, a revenue operations leader, go-to-market strategist, and business operator who has spent more than 15 years helping organizations build scalable revenue engines through stronger systems, leadership alignment, and operational discipline. Throughout his career, Bryan has worked at the intersection of CRM strategy, revenue operations, and organizational growth. He has held executive leadership roles, including Chief Revenue Officer, Chief Operating Officer at Aptitude 8, helping companies align marketing, sales, customer success around shared processes, trusted data, and measurable outcomes. What makes Bryan's perspective especially valuable is his belief that growth doesn't create problems, it exposes them. As organizations scale, leadership alignment, process discipline, and cross-functional collaboration become increasingly important. Bryan has seen firsthand how misalignment can slow growth and how simple, well-executed systems can transform performance. Bryan, welcome to the RevOps Champions podcast.
Thanks for having me, Brendon. Really excited for a conversation today.
Awesome. I was so excited about this conversation because, of course, there's so much overlap between, what you believe and how you operate and what we believe and operate. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, knowing that your focus now is very much under the umbrella of the healthcare industry. Ours is very much under the franchise space, and there's potentially some overlap there. But I think how we approach things is so similar, and I know that our audience is going to learn a lot from this conversation today.
Likewise.
So, Bryan, you spent your career helping companies build scalable revenue systems. What originally pulled you into the world of revenue operations and go-to-market strategy?
Yeah, that's a good question, Brendon. I think, being in consulting for most of my formative years, early and on the road, I think it's probably one of the biggest problems we saw again and again at organizations across industries. I did a lot of work in the construction technology industry where it was kind of glaring, and during my time at HubSpot, got to see a lot of different industries where it's a problem that a lot of organizations, may not even realize they have, right? Because everything is fine until suddenly it's not, right? I think many businesses outscale technology and, their application needs before they even know it. And I think the solution to that became really intriguing to me, and the technology, that can fill that solution. And, that's when I determined about, 5 or 7 years ago, I guess, to kind of really build a career around HubSpot, and I think that because I think it's the best tool on the market to solve these revenue operations problems and opportunities, that we see across industry.
Right. I know that you say that knowing that technology ultimately doesn't solve any business problems. So let's get back to the things that I know you deal with and the things that we deal with when it comes to successfully setting up a revenue engine for business, whether they're in the healthcare space or in the franchise space or anywhere else. And that is, I know you and I are both very passionate about the importance of alignment. And I think you've said alignment eats strategy for breakfast. Why do you believe leadership alignment becomes so critical as organizations grow?
I think, man, it's just so necessary. I think the converse is probably the most true there because a lack of alignment is extremely detrimental. And I think probably, thereby the alignment being beneficial. But what helps, I think here, it's not being aligned, I think, that is the valuable thing. I think it's the process that leadership teams have to go through to become aligned, right? And that's requesting dissent, like let's disagree and have a conversation about it. You kind of share your point of view. I'll share mine, he or she or they share theirs. And I think it's the discussions that help groups reach consensus and alignment.
Hmm.
That's why it's so valuable, because when we're all in agreement, we've reached alignment, that should indicate that the necessary discussions happen to get there, right? And compare that to a CEO saying, "Here's a strategy, go forth and do it," without group alignment, without everyone's perspective. It's much more likely to fail. And that's why, I mean, I've seen the best strategies kind of go awry, as a result of just a lack of alignment. Not everyone is on board with that plan or idea,
Hmm.
and then sometimes a poor strategy, when iterated upon or discussed upon amongst the right group of folks in the right room, if we're aligned on, even if the strategy is not perfect, if we all think it's probably pretty good enough, if we're all committed to that,
Hmm.
those initiatives seem to be much my experience.
Yeah, and actually just get to work and at least test it, and if it doesn't
Right.
work, then you can of course go back and change the strategy, but it's a lot easier to do when you have alignment. Yeah, really,
It's true.
really good. So Brian, when organizations, so you've seen this again. You and I have both seen this in multiple industries that we've built systems for, and no matter what industry a company is in, they go through they break through these ceilings of complexity, and the reason that they end up speaking to either you or our team is because they've outgrown their technology systems, right? But we also know that there are some other things that have to be in place or aligned before we can actually build a new system for them. So let's maybe dig into, so when organizations begin to scale, where do you most often see revenue teams break down first? And what are the warning signs leaders should watch for?
Yeah, I think the things that go wrong initially that you need to be vigilant about is, as founders, there's a very hard realization many founders have to go through where, the folks you started the business with are probably different than the people you'll exit the business with, right? And
Hmm.
there's a lot of reasons for that along the way, but at different growth junctures, you need to identify. It always starts with the people, right? Do I have the
Hmm.
right people on the bus? Is this the right team at this growth juncture?
Hmm.
And your starting salesperson that was great selling in a certain segment, or, very, very scrappy in your initial go to market stages, is probably not the same kind of person that's going to be a scaled revenue leader, that can run a team of 5 or 10 account executives and put up millions of dollars of revenue. I mean, it's possible that somebody progresses like that in their career, but, I think as executive teams, frequently identifying, assessing the people you have and confirming everyone's still in the right role. It doesn't mean they don't work in the organization. Maybe we shift roles internally, but I think you've got to have the people before the process. And I think that's probably the first one. If we're sure we've got the right people in the right places, it's assessing, the process, and that leads to technology decisions from there, right? Are we
Hmm.
going about things the right way? Does our methodology need to change? Is because the market's dynamic and the market's always changing. And I think where organizations fail is when they don't adapt to that, right? How we sell in 2026 is very different than how we sold in 2019 for a lot of reasons, right? And
Yeah.
that's different than the earlier 2000s. And I think
Hmm.
organizations who are evolving are looking at the people first, the process, procedure, methodology, and that lends to discussing around technology. Okay. Are our
Hmm.
people supported by the right technology? Do
Yeah.
we have the right CRM in place? Do we have a CRM in place? Maybe
Hmm.
we've outscaled Google Sheets. Maybe
Hmm.
Excel is probably the number one CRM in the world, right?
Hmm.
It will get you pretty far, but at a certain growth juncture, you've got to value your technology needs as well. And I think organizations that are doing that consistently every 3 to 5 years are continuing to grow and scale and have success in healthcare and in other organizations. And those that don't and kind of stick with the status quo, particularly, in this era of AI, are going to have a hard time growing and scaling. They're going to stagnate, and, people will ultimately leave those organizations, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and I think as you were talking there, I mean the reason that scaling businesses eventually outgrow Excel or Google Sheets, which again I think to your point, full credit. I mean they're incredibly powerful tools, right? But as you scale and grow, you are going to outgrow because you're to your point, you're adding people. When you're adding people, your processes need to change, and because you're also not just adding people, you're adding layers of people. You're adding management
Complexity.
layers. Exactly.
Hmm.
And as soon as you
Yep.
add complexity, eventually, a spreadsheet is going to break, which then comes time to assess, well, what do you do to get you to the next? And I think to your point, like it's not just the people that got you here aren't going to get you to where you're going. It's your processes and your systems.
Right.
And you could argue that what the metrics or KPIs that you're measuring at each of these stages is also going to evolve. So
It's true.
absolutely, yeah.
It's often a compelling event, right, Brendan? Like, at some point we identify, hey, we miss a revenue number, or, we're not getting enough leads, or, in our healthcare, healthcare POV, we see, we hired a new provider, we need to get more patients,
Hmm.
or we've identified because we're looking at data, right? Our patients are not returning or they're going otherwhere, elsewhere. There's
Hmm.
usually a compelling event to say, hey, like we need something to better capture this, better document this, et cetera. A kind of convergence we see pretty often in healthcare on the provider side is, so many medical practices have an EMR or, electronic medical record system or
Hmm.
practice managed system. That's where the doctor puts all of your medical information in the computer.
Hmm.
They'll have a charting system where they keep your medical records. And that's, I mean, technically, probably all you need to run a medical practice, that and an email. But what's missing from that, and other organizations have similar, I think, bottlenecks, but that system is not going to help you nurture your existing patients. They
Hmm.
have no ability really to do patient engagement or follow up or healthcare, we talk a lot about this concept of creating like meaningful or lasting relationships instead of transactional. Because
Hmm.
healthcare, by definition, is typically transactional. We don't want to go to the doctor. We need to, right? And,
Hmm.
if I'm going to the dentist, I'm going for a particular reason, and that's it. I don't want to hang out there, unlike going to the mall or other industries. And I think, so these are all compelling events where something has happened to the organization, a data point is missed, a KPI was missed, we reached a growth juncture, where we need to look at the market and see what tools are available to help us solve this problem. And I think
Hmm.
what many organizations find is, again, across all industries, a CRM is usually that first big investment, right? That and your marketing automation platforms, your two big steps up in maturity. And all roads typically lead to a HubSpot or, a Salesforce if, that's the route you decide to go.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the other things that of course is you know Dynamico was born out of this belief that technology, like so many other things, is going to continue to change, which means that as business leaders, we have to be dynamic in first of all realizing that and setting that expectation that the systems that we built that we build now aren't going to last forever. And the way that we've also evolved is a system is not something that you build once and then it's done. We treat it as a practice. So like we sort of the analogy we use, the yoga analogy. You don't just do yoga for a month and then suddenly you get the benefits for life. It's a practice that you do on a weekly or more frequent basis. We see the same thing with the systems that we're building. And of course, because technology is evolving, I think a really good example is the Epic HubSpot integration, which I'm sure, is life changing. Is for so many, businesses in the sort of the health and medical space that wasn't an option before, right? So it was a limitation potentially and an obstacle to more folks and businesses in that industry not using HubSpot. Now with a native integration, that changes everything, and suddenly the opportunity to have a more operationally efficient and scalable business becomes real. I know you and I talk also that technology doesn't necessarily solve your business problems, but once you've identified what the problems are, and you can then bring in technology to streamline what you're doing, that can be like life changing.
Certainly. I mean, we see it every day, and that's why we're in the business we're in, right? I think, technology in the hands of the right people saves time, saves money, and ultimately improves people's, quality of life. I mean, it is an enabler of productivity when we're doing it right here. And I think that's a lot of the discussions that we end up having with clients, in the sales process is, I know I need a tool, but I don't know what I need it to do. Or, these are the
Hmm.
problems we're having. What tools are available that can help us solve this problem? And people are rarely going, you know what, I need to buy a CRM today. That's just not what typically happens. It's usually,
Right.
hey, we've got these problems. We think a CRM is what we need. And I think there's always really good discussion with businesses kind of around, is a CRM what you need, or do you need something different? And
Hmm.
from our POV, there's kind of three or four segments probably that tools fall into. It's organizations who need more lead generation or demand gen. Perhaps you really just need a marketing automation platform. You need a marketing hub or
Hmm.
something like that. You don't always need the CRM. Or perhaps sales and marketing are fine. That's going great. We can't service our existing customers, right? We need a customer support or service solution. That's a different problem set, right? We
Hmm.
see it with ERP systems as well. Hey, I'm having a hard time managing our inventory and keeping track of that. And Our sales reps writing quotas. We look at CPQ or ERP. So there's, these buckets of technologies that are all kind of tied back to solving the individual problems. But to your point, Brendan, just having the technology itself is not going to solve the problem.
Yeah.
It can, if implemented correctly, right, by the right team, and
Hmm.
adopted, more importantly, adopted by your team, right? But I think those are, other things to keep aware of. The technology investment is the first piece of it. The implementation is the second piece. And
Hmm.
then, as you said, the continuous yoga of adoption, right, and continuous improvement is the other piece. You really need all three.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the other things that we have in common, between Forecast and Dynamico is we both eventually realize the power and importance of specialization. So you've gone deep into the healthcare space, we've gone deep into the franchise space, because what we've both realized and our teams have realized is that just implementing the HubSpot CRM, there are hundreds of partners who have the ability to stand up a HubSpot CRM and integrate it, with whatever other technology you use. But it's the architecture of that. You have to understand the differences between, like in our case, the complexities of a two-tier, franchise with corporate and then hundreds of franchisees, and in your case, the complexities and the differences in the healthcare space. That the consulting and the advice and the architecture that we bring is really what is so critical and important, because to your point, you cannot just build the technology. It has to be customized specifically for that business.
That's right. We see it often. And I mean, within SaaS, businesses are probably similar, at least. But as we look at more highly specialized industries like franchise, like healthcare, logistics, manufacturing, there's people go to school and have entire degrees to become experts in the industry, right? And,
Hmm.
your average consultant, it could be the best HubSpot consultant or CRM consultant, and to be general here today,
Hmm.
they're not going to have the same level of subject matter expertise. They just can't acquire it, right? And as in most partners across all CRM consulting, firms, they're working with clients in multiple different industries, but the technology is the same.
Hmm.
However, what we found is you become more specialized in each industries, that implementation looks completely different. And there's no
Hmm.
there's no shortcut. You're not going to push a button and implement HubSpot for medical practice. Not well, anyway, right?
Yeah.
Because there's just so much nuance, right? And you need,
Hmm.
and the context is lacking,
Hmm.
and what we see, like to give you an example, how a laboratory association, or a tools equipment manufacturer within healthcare, or a medical
Hmm.
device, or an optometrist,
Hmm.
in a surgical practice, how they all use HubSpot is going to be completely different. So there's no real shortcut, to doing this. But I think, for us, I mean, we're owned and operated by active licensed practicing nurses, and I think that helps a lot. They don't want to hear from me necessarily, right? They want to hear from
Hmm.
someone who's worked in hospitals for 20 years, right? Has that
Hmm.
career experience and has done this exact thing many, many, many times. And I think that that type of expert knowledge is becoming more and more and more valuable, especially in the age of AI, where anyone can throw something to Claude nowadays, right? But Claude is not going to. It's not just going to become an industry expert. It isn't. There's not going to be a replacement for that know-how, right? As we look at in your firm's instance, a lot of partners have implemented a franchise or two, right? You all have
Hmm.
done it dozens and dozens of times, right? And there's a lot of value that comes with those repetitions. You're avoiding mistakes. You know how to look at the systems across multiple disparate systems across the different franchisees, and
Hmm.
come up with a scalable integration plan. And we're not missing things or forgetting things because
Hmm.
you've already learned from those mistakes in the past, right? We've already made those mistakes. And we see
Absolutely.
that in healthcare all the time, right? Where, it's, here's how you make a mistake, go into a sales call with a health medical practice and say, so what's your sales team like today? Tell me what your sales team does. It doesn't exist, right? It's
Mm.
patient acquisition, right?
Yeah.
Like technically it's sales, right? But
Hmm.
how you architect a CRM for new patient acquisition is very different than B2B or B2C sales, right?
Hmm.
And it's little nuances like that that I think most generalist firms wouldn't know, and that's I think that's fine. But it certainly creates opportunities for organizations to double down and triple down in these industries and become the best at that particular thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So, okay. So, Brian, I mean, I know we've touched on this already multiple times, and you talk often about the importance of process. How do you build enough structure to create accountability and scale without creating bureaucracy that slows teams down?
A tough one. I guess by any definition, installing a new process does require more rigor. I think it's an unpopular opinion, but I like to elicit feedback from the users in the process. Revolutionary, I know, but many organizations I've consulted with, a leadership team with the best intentions and the best data will prescribe a new policy or procedure,
Hmm.
and it doesn't get adopted well for one of many reasons. But if it's not ultimately helping people or solving a clear purpose, not every process procedure is going to help your teams move faster, right?
Hmm.
Some process procedure is for the benefit of the business to be more compliant, right? Or more effective or more, profitable even, right? But I think everyone needs to understand why that is. And I see a lot of leaders just throwing out process. Well, this is how we do it now. This is how we do it now. And if the team lacks the context and they don't understand why we do it that way, there's going to be resistance. There's going to be friction. And I
Hmm.
think that's a key part of it as well, just communicating around it. And then when the process is, live and implemented, I think we'd be foolish to think that we're going to get it right every time in the design room, right? It looks good on a whiteboard. In
Hmm.
practice, a little bit different. I'd come back to your yoga analogy there, where every time we're rolling out a new process procedure, give it a few weeks or a few months and then kind of take a look. Hey, is it working? Is it working as we intended? Is it doing what we wanted? If so, great. Maybe we nailed it. If not, let's tweak it here a little bit, right? But yeah, I think it's rare that we get it 100% right out of the box. But I think when do you do this? When you're seeing inconsistency in quality is the easiest, I think, telltale sign, right? When projects are being delivered differently by different consultants, or a particular type of work is being completed with varying levels of deliverable quality, if like that. If
Hmm.
you see variance in what should be your standard product, I think that's where you really got to look at the process and procedure.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you were talking there, of course, it goes back to the fact that the reason that processes are having to change is because the business, the organization is growing, and you're adding people you're adding levels of people. When you add levels of people, your processes have to change. And then the other piece of it is it brings back the importance of communication. And one of the things that I know you're familiar with from the last sort of 5 to 7 years of your experience that sort of separated firms like ours from many others was the change management component, right? Where and you just gave a perfect example of it. Like when you are rolling out a new process, it's the communication is this is new. It's not cast in stone. We're gonna try it on for a few weeks and we'll iterate as we go. But again, having that, the way you communicate that is so important, and knowing that the users, to your point, that they feel that they have the training, they have the support, and if they do that, the process and the tools that have changed within that process are going to be adopted and, of course, more successfully used. Which and I know that you and I, this is another thing that is we both agree on, and that adoption is the ultimate measure of a successful implementation, whether it's a process or a technology. If it's not adopted, then it doesn't really mean much. So the basic question is, well, what do we need to do to make sure that we do achieve adoption? And of course, it's communication and the change management piece of that, which again touches on the importance of the people that have to navigate that change.
Yeah, agree. And I would distill it down, even to, I'll say a toddler level. I've got a toddler here at home and he's in that stage where, but why? But why, Dad? But why? But why?
Hmm.
Go clean your room. But why? Or go get your shoes. But why? I
Yeah.
think if leaders can just answer the but why question, I think new process procedure seems to turn adults into a little bit of a toddler sometimes, but
Yeah.
myself included. But I
Hmm.
think it's the but why, right? And I think it's okay if it benefits a business. We need it for this reason. It helps us, right? Or
Hmm.
benefits you, or it benefits our clients. I think if
Yeah.
there's a benefit in one of those kind of three areas, then people understand why the change happened. I think
Hmm.
adoption is going to be much more. You're going to get less pushback, less resistance, and it's going to resonate better. But
Yeah.
a surprising number of leaders can't offer that, or don't offer that, or I think prematurely roll something out without thinking through the repercussions of that. But why?
Yeah. Yeah. One of my coaches, the alternative that he uses is so that. So
Yeah.
if you say something and you say, well, and he says, well, so that, and you have to be able to you know peel the onion so that you're making sure that you're getting closer to the the actual solution or the root cause or whatever it is. But if you don't ask that question at least three times, like your toddler does, then you might be skipping a lot of the important value that could come out of it. Yeah. So, Brian, let's move on to sort of the how we sort of measure all of this as we go. So, as you know, all businesses, again, assuming if they're not growing, they don't have to worry about most of the things we're talking about. But if they are growing and they're trying to be more efficient and more scalable, and of course now there seems to be an even bigger spotlight than there typically has been around sort of data, whether you call it, you know, KPIs or metrics or OKRs. You know, every organization has some form of data that they're measuring to ensure that they're making progress. And one of the things we hear about a lot is that, you know, companies in all industries are collecting enormous amounts of data, but they're still struggling to act on it. What separates, in your mind, organizations that simply look at data from those that actually make business decisions because of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's certainly no shortage of data, in 2026.
Hmm.
But to your point, I think a surprising number of organizations we work with are really using their data to their best of their abilities. I think I'd probably come back to people here a little bit, right? Where it takes a savvy financial leader or revenue leader or marketing leader to really sit down with the business and kind of come up with the KPIs and metrics that are relevant
Hmm.
and track them, because by doing so, you're volunteering to hold yourself accountable to those same metrics, right? And I
Hmm.
think some people maybe fear that, right? What if I hit my number? Forecasting's hard when it's stressful. Revenue
Hmm.
forecasting is really hard for all businesses. I want every revenue leader out there to know, like, it's stressful to sit down and say, hey, I'm going to commit to this revenue number for the quarter or for the year based upon these things that I think, right?
Hmm.
But I think the transition from I think to looking at historical data, right? And that's going to inform the future. So the advice I give, folks as they're, developing these metrics the first time is your best predictor of the future is going to be history, right? So, as you look at quarterly trends, many businesses have a quarterly trend if you overlay the P&L over years, right? Look at your competitors and similar sized organizations. What kind of numbers are they putting up? You'd
Hmm.
be surprised, if you take a call to the competitor, they may share some numbers with you. I mean, I've been privileged to that where, hey, we're running at this run rate, or we're at this run rate, or we're similar or different.
Hmm.
So I think peers is a great resource. Historicals is a great resource. And again, I'd come back probably to that alignment here, right? If the leadership team all thinks it's probably the right data, it's probably the right data. I'll tell you
Hmm.
what's not the right data is when the CEO or CFO says, this is your number, right? And they're
Hmm.
not seeking input from, the folks actually delivering the work, right? I mean, that's also a great way to lose your sales and marketing team is just to prescribe the numbers that the ivory tower thinks are correct.
Hmm.
And you're so that or the but why, right? I think behind every metric, you've got to have a good reason as to why that's set and why it's established, and be able to defend it. I
Hmm.
think most of the time I talk to sales reps who, you know, have missed quota for one reason or another. I hear what their quota is, and there's no way in heck they're going to hit that. So where did this quota come from? Well, it's just what they said. Or I look at managers or directors who don't have an input in that number, and that's really challenging. I
Hmm.
think so. Getting the number right the first time using the data is probably half the battle. And I think if the numbers are correct, I look at quota like this, Brendon. So, you know, as you set marketing or sales quotas or sales service quotas, right? Like, satisfactory performance should hit the number. Exceptional performance should be able to exceed it, and
Hmm.
unsatisfactory performance should not hit it. Right? You're
Yeah,
going to have all three levels of that in an organization. Nobody's hitting 120%
absolutely.
all the time. But if the team is consistently not hitting quota, you failed your team by setting an incorrect metric to begin with.
Hmm.
Likewise, if your team is, hitting it 150% every month, it's probably too low. So I think
Hmm.
that continuous review and adjustment in benchmarking is how you do that. Maybe,
Yeah,
probably.
right, right. So, okay, so Brian, we're sort of on the downstretch here, sort of starting to wrap up, and we've touched on all these things already in the conversation. And for the I haven't mentioned it yet in this episode. I typically mention it on every single episode at least once, which is our sort of model for revenue operations, which are and the four pillars that we use at Dynamico, which are people, process, data, and technology, right? So, and we've touched on all four of those and in different ways, which I love because they are all connected. And I think to your point as well, and I totally agree. It starts with people. If you don't have the right people, the right culture, the right direction, the right communication, it's going to be really hard to do anything downstream from there. It's going to be hard to establish the correct processes and to evolve the processes as the business grows. It's going to be hard to understand what the correct metrics or KPIs are, and it's going to be hard to build the technology tools that you need to drive the results. Right. So, what do you have a variation of that model as you think about? Because I know you think about revenue operations a lot yourself. What is your model for revenue operations?
I'd say very, very similar. I think, we talk a lot about people and process. Those are certainly the big pieces of it. Personally, I think data is really big for me. The technology, in models I've talked about or prescribed to, it's certainly probably assumed under data, but I think it's people and process. What I come back to kind of again and again and again, right? If you have the right people in the right room, I think you'll go pretty far here as you look
Yeah.
at that kind of under the lens of revenue operations here. You know, I'd say it almost follows that order, Brendan, right? Like assuming you have the right people on the team, right?
Hmm.
I think process is probably the next thing to look at here.
Hmm.
I'd maybe bundle technology and data there because I think that technology is what ultimately results in the data. And without
Hmm.
the technology, it's really hard to get access to the data. But I think those are probably the pieces of the puzzle here. But ultimately, it's the people who are
Hmm.
going to determine the correct process. Those two things, some combination thereof, probably indicate or dictate the correct technology because that's different on a per firm basis. HubSpot's
Hmm.
not a great fit for every organization. I think most it probably is, right?
Hmm.
Likewise, you look at a Zoho or something like that, or yeah, talk to organizations that are fine with using Monday.com,
Hmm.
but many would not be. And I think it depends on how your business operates. There's so many technologies nowadays. I think the challenge that I would pose against that is maybe a litmus test or to proof out that theory is there's coming this emergence of hundreds, thousands of really great AI point solutions. And I think I'm pretty interesting to see how that pans out, right? Because in revenue operations, we had point solutions. We got away from them for consolidated tools, which we like. And now
Hmm.
we're seeing this reconvergence of all these point solutions come back into the market, and folks are starting to shift there. So it was, I got HubSpot, I'm good. Or I got Salesforce, I'm good. Well, now I use HubSpot for this, and this AI point solution for this, and this one for that. And so, I guess what I would pose back to you maybe as a question, Brendan, is, how does that impact the model, right? That, we're seeing a major technology pivot. AI is coming in. What we've done for the last 5 years is starting to break up again. We were broken up, we're consolidated, we're breaking up again. As you
Hmm.
look at that in the lens of your people, process, data, technology,
Hmm.
how do you tackle that or approach that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think two ways. One is, I think one of the reasons that, and I guess we probably have to put a disclaimer out there, you and I both, that we drink a lot of orange Kool-Aid, but it's because of the culture that HubSpot has created beyond the incredible product that they create, which again fits into that people piece and it informs their processes and why they do things, solving for the customer. But the other thing, sort of going to the other end of the spectrum, the reason that you and I have confidence in building our solutions and our revenue engines on the HubSpot platform is because they are leading the sort of the race toward AI. It was the first CRM to essentially connect to all the major LLMs, which we know is how we and all our clients, current and future, or now and in the future, will use HubSpot. It's going to be somehow connected to, you know, let's just say Claude, and they, through the MCPs, they're going to be connecting all their tools through an LLM, which right now, let's say it's Claude, but ultimately you still need the CRM to do what CRMs do, especially for the types of organizations that you and I work for. They're not going to be vibe coding a CRM over the weekend because there's just too much at stake. We're
True,
talking
it's
about
true.
100 million, 300 million, $500 million organizations or $1 billion organizations. They don't, they're never going to just replace their CRM, but they obviously, and that's part of our job of helping them as the technology evolves. Our mission is to help the companies that we work with, those leadership teams, always harness technology to stay in touch with their customers. And in your case, many times with
Mhm.
patients, and how they, in our case, it's like, how do they manage the customer relationship? In your case, it's how do you manage the patient care and relationship? And, you always need to do that. And the interesting part of this, which is why I like the fact that we have data separated a little bit, is because the data layer is the one thing that is separating somewhat. because as you and I both well know, for the longest time, HubSpot was the single source of truth
Mhm.
for pretty much all our clients. That might evolve now. And I think HubSpot accepts that, and so does everybody else. And we just have to figure out what the next best solution is. So maybe it's not one single source of truth any longer. It's a data layer that sits on top of your technology that makes your processes possible and gives your people the tools that they need to be the best at their jobs, and tease their family and friends at the barbecue on a Sunday saying that they have better tools and processes and therefore work at a better company, and maybe they should consider coming over and working with them.
Love it.
Which comes back, I think, to something that you touched on, which is it all comes down to employee experience. So, whether you're working in a hospital or an optometrist or a home services franchise, you have a job, and you want a job that is more than just a job. You want a job where you believe in where the company is going, the vision and mission of the brand, et cetera, and have the tool to do the best job that you possibly can. Which, again, those employees, of course, they also need to step up and change as change happens. Because if they don't, then to your earlier point of the people that got you here aren't going to get you to where you're going. Change is part of growth, and both personally and in business, right?
It's true. I think an example of that, changing with the times, I guess, but kind of following the pace of technology is a former colleague of mine. They were in a marketing role, and the team really identified they would benefit from GTM engineering, and they got Clay, and this person never used Clay before, and they were kind of forced with the decision, hey, I either need to become good at this and adopt these new tools and become more of a modern marketer, or I need
Hmm.
to kind of reevaluate my career decisions, and they, chose to adopt a technology, become very proficient at it, and learn a tool that, a year ago, 2 years ago, they certainly wasn't on their mental roadmap here. But I
Hmm.
think as the technologies change and evolve, I think the team has to, likewise be open to adopting those. Even if you look at HubSpot as a container, I mean, there's, it feels like hundreds of new releases every time they do a quarterly release, and it takes intentional effort these days to keep up with all the enhancements they're making, which is a great problem to have, and quite a luxury. We're fortunate that they're continuously improving, but it
Hmm.
does put onus on our consultants and solution architects and team members to stay current, and stay up to date with those new technologies, such that when our clients come to us and say things like, "Hey, we heard HubSpot has an MCP server, supports agents. Can you help us with that?" You
Hmm.
know, you have to learn that, and you think you've got to do some professional education and upskilling to remain relevant.
Yeah, and I think that is really good advice. What you just shared is really good advice for any person in any role, including the millions of people who will never, listen or hear this episode. Is that with all the opportunity that AI brings right now, if you just focus on one thing, which is focusing on the things that only you can do, that no machine will ever do, you will always be able to add value in whatever work you do, right? And it's we know that it's hard because for we've most of us have been through a similar sort of education process for anywhere from 12 to 20 years of being essentially programmed to be machines, and now we have to take and unprogram all that learning, that there are now machines that can do better work than what we were programmed to do. So we now need to reprogram ourselves to be better humans, and then have the machines to do the things that we don't want to do, and they can do better, right?
Right.
So anyway, but there's a lot of complexity that comes with that, and I know we don't have enough time to necessarily take into all
Separate
of that.
episode. Yeah, part two.
Yes, exactly. So, Brian, maybe as we wrap up, we already touched on this earlier, but as HubSpot continues expanding into different industries, and HubSpot is not an industry specific solution, and it doesn't look
Mhm.
like they ever will be, but who knows? You've argued that platform expertise alone is not enough, and we've already touched on this. Maybe talk a little bit more about why industry specialization is becoming increasingly important for consultants, agencies, and implementation partners.
Yeah, buyers are becoming more savvy, right? I think AI has, many pros and cons, I think, for society. A big pro, or, if you're a buyer, you don't have to rely on the salesperson, right, anymore. If we look back 5 or 10 years ago, if I was buying into new technology, sure, I could Google things and probably find some articles about it that somebody was probably paid to do.
Hmm.
Otherwise, I'm kind of at the mercy of the sales process evaluation. I've got a salesperson, maybe a solution architect,
Hmm.
A telling me their software is great, B is telling me their software is great. Maybe I talk to friends and colleagues. Now I've got this thing called AI in my hands where I can ask Gemini, Claude, GPT, all three if I want, what's the best CRM for my type of business? Or, or what's the best, how what are some questions I should ask in the software evaluation? And so
Hmm.
buyers have tools that in hand now that make them much more savvy, far more informed, right? And as
Hmm.
as we're looking at particularly implementation partners, or given that I've chosen the right software, who's going to implement it? Buyers know more now than ever how important that is, and they know it
Hmm.
because 5 years ago they bought a technology and the implementation went poorly, right? And
Hmm.
people get fired over that,
Yep.
or the implementation went well and they want to have that happen again. But most technology leaders who've been around a while have seen one or more implementations go poorly. It costs the team time, it costs the money, there's a lot of risk. So
Hmm.
anytime, we're investing in new software, we know now, buyers know that a lot of the risk relies on the implementation partner who you choose. That's probably as important a decision, as investing in the right software. And
Hmm.
so as we're evaluating, different partners of level competency, if I'm in a situation where, hey, I've got three partners and I kind of like all three. Maybe I can narrow it down to two based upon how well they run their sales process.
Hmm.
My confidence, in their ability to get the job done is half the battle. I always tell people all the time, right? We sell trust and confidence. Those are
Hmm.
two things we sell, right? Do you
Hmm.
you trust, that my team knows what we're doing, right? And that this
Hmm.
is the right solution, and do you have confidence that we're actually able to execute the solution we've demonstrated? As you
Hmm.
look at subject matter expertise, that industry specialization becoming more and more and more important. In a lot of
Yeah.
opportunities we're faced at, buyers tell us, hey, we're choosing to work with forecast. The reason is, your healthcare specialization, your subject matter expertise. We don't have to explain the hundreds of acronyms to you, or how
Hmm.
this works, or how hospital operations work, because our team knows that, right? And I
Hmm.
think, probably likewise, in your world, Dynamico, right? Like, I have two partners that are both similar. One's worked with franchises hundreds of times, and one's done two franchises or 20 franchises. I have more confidence that because you've done it more times, you're going to do a better job. I might
Hmm.
even like the other partner more, right? But ultimately, it comes down to who I have the most confidence in as a human. Who do I
Hmm.
want to work with, and who do I think is going to be able to set this up for my team, the most effectively? And I
Yeah.
think it's always been important, but as informed buyers, it's becoming more and more and more important. And I hope that, across all software technologies, more implementation vendors are taking that route, because I think it's going to be helpful and
I
necessary.
totally agree. Totally agree. So maybe one last question, just maybe flip that back to, so a lot of the folks listening, whether they're in the sort of healthcare and medical space or in the franchise space or otherwise, a lot of people in both the healthcare and franchise space are sitting on legacy systems. And what advice do you have for the leadership teams of those types of organizations that might give them sort of the permission to sort of look, to know that maybe it might be time to look to replace their legacy systems,
Oh man, that's a tough question. As far as when to make the decision or when to evaluate it,
or when to know that this your legacy system is likely holding back your growth or scalability.
easy answer. If you're using Excel, if it's 2026 teams, if you're still running your business operations out of Excel or Google Sheets, it is time for maturation. It is time to upgrade and invest in a technology. I mean that in seriousness as much as
Mhm.
jest, but what I would say is, like, it's as soon as revenue substantiates the ability to make the investment is probably when you should do it, right? I mean, you can
Mhm.
get by for a few years, with those kind of beginner level tools, Google Sheets, email, and a website's probably all I need to get started here. Your
Mhm.
next growth juncture is you're going to need kind of a starter CRM, right? Which is, again, one of the reasons I'm so bullish on HubSpot, right? Because it can be your starter CRM. You can get the starter suite for $35 a month
Mhm.
and running multi-million-dollar business on it. We have clients who do it. I mean, I
Mhm.
know people who do it, right? And using the same technology without having to migrate off or switch, you can scale that to 5, 10, $25 million, upgrading, as you go. And I think that's a very unique model. So the advice there would be, invest in a set of tools as early as you can afford it. Ideally, a tool that can grow with you, right? And I
Mhm.
think HubSpot is, from our opinion, in a POV, and I see them all, usually the best investment for those businesses. When you reach 25 minute revenue, maybe then evaluate. Maybe you need an ERP, or, more of a back end solutions. But on the CRM, marketing automation, the service side, that gets you very, very, very far.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I think maybe adding to that, that we know that the technology scales. HubSpot scales from like literally a one person business to 2,000 employees and more. The But I think going back to what you were saying before about special industry specialization is, again, make sure that you're working with someone who's guiding you through the different stages of growth, that beyond just what the technology can do, because again, the technology still has to be implemented and integrated according to your evolving needs, right?
Right, right. And the last point I'd say there in closing, Brendan, is be aware of that as well, right? AI can be used for good and bad. And we've had to fix a number of projects this year where somebody bought HubSpot with good intentions, worked with a partner they chose with good intentions, and that
Hmm.
person just used some AI application to just zip out implementation and said, "Oh, we're done." And the clients are like, no, we're not done. This is not implemented in the way that we need it to. Maybe it is in the way that you think it to. So just, as you're evaluating implementation vendors, again, no matter what tool it is, make sure you understand what you're getting out of an implementation. Obviously, we should all be using AI to be faster and more productive for our clients. But if we're using it as a shortcut, you can't shortcut a good implementation. You just can't. And it's going to cause problems, and you're going to have a lot of risk as a client. So just make sure you just pressure test your partners and understand how they're using AI, hopefully to benefit you and instead of, doing the work. Because the worst thing is for someone to pay $20,000 for an implementation and somebody vibe codes it or throws it into a tool or purchases a tool and, you know, gets it done in 8 or 10 hours and charges you all that money. And it's, we're seeing that as a trend across all technologies. And I
Hmm.
think that's just something buyers should be aware of.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Brian, thanks again so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed the conversation and the sort of the crossovers and similarities between what we're both dealing with in completely different industries, and of course the fact that we both feel really confident about the platform that we've chosen to help our clients scale from relatively small businesses to multi billion dollar businesses. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.